Hey, how's it going? So I was just able to talk to Jamie Whyte, the former leader of the ACT Party, just prior to David Seymour. So he was leader for just one election, and he didn't get elected. So they only elected one MP that election, and that was David Seymour himself winning Epsom. But then David Seymour became the new leader. Now this is my third interview of ACT Party leaders. I've talked to Don Brash, David Seymour, and now Jamie Whyte. And this is my final interview that I've lined up for this series. And then my main video about the entire history of the ACT Party will be coming out relatively soon. So I need to include this interview in there as well and some more stuff. So yeah, that'll come out relatively soon, so really stay tuned. So I hope you enjoy the interview. I apologize the video didn't really record properly, so it's just audio for this. So I've been working on a project to look at the history of the ACT Party in New Zealand. And to do that, I wanted to talk to various leaders of the party throughout its time. I've spoken to Dr. Don Brash and David Seymour about it, the current leader. And I thought I would talk to you as well, the leader of the party in 2014.
Sure.
I really appreciate you giving up your time to talk to me. So I was wondering about your impressions on the Rogernomic era of New Zealand, in the mid-'80s.
Right, well, those were extremely important economic reforms that were made in New Zealand. I mean, the basic reforms were they changed the tax regime. So they introduced goods and services tax and reduced income taxes. They liberalized the exchange rate. It was no longer a fixed exchange rate, it's free floating. They got rid of all the currency controls, so you could transact freely in foreign exchange, which had all been controlled. They removed an enormous amount of import licenses and generally licensing in the economy. And so it was a great liberalization, and it kind of got New Zealand, it actually got New Zealand ahead of a lot of other countries in terms of the liberalization program that was going on already in other countries in the 80s. What they didn't do was they didn't liberalize the labor market. In fact, they didn't get rid of compulsory unionism. And the reason for that is quite straightforward, which is that they were backed by the trade unions. That's where they got their funding from. So they were keen on compulsory unionism. But my view is that they were generally extremely good transformations, and they were continued on by Ruth Richardson when the National Party got into power in 1990.
Right. Yes, thank you. I was wondering, I read in a Herald article that you campaigned for the New Zealand Party in 1984.
I did.
Yeah, so what was your thoughts on the New Zealand Party opposed to what the Labour Party actually brought in with Rogernomics? I understand they didn't really run on a lot of their reforms. So
the New Zealand Party was advocating more or less the same policies that Labour, in fact, enacted. It was led by Bob Jones. I think if I recall rightly, it was a long time ago now, the New Zealand Party had a policy of school vouchers. So that would have been all schools would have been charter schools. I think that was one of the policies, but otherwise it was very similar to what the Labour Party did. And when the Labour Party got elected and did all that, Bob Jones just said, well, we're not necessary anymore. We're getting what we want, and he disbanded the party.
Yeah.
So he wasn't really interested in being a politician. He just wanted, things had to get changed. I mean, Rob Muldoon was becoming a true menace, not just to the economy, but to liberty.
So you became the leader of the ACT Party in 2014. I was wondering what the process of the leadership election was in that time. I understand that John Pascal wanted to become the leader as well. I was wondering, was there like a close election?
I don't know if it's a close election. It's decided by the board. It's not done by the party members. It's done by the board. So when I arrived in New Zealand, and I was in the running for this, I went around and I met all the board members and made my case to them individually. And then there was a meeting one day, and we both, John Pascal and I, had to pitch to them. I mean, separately. It was a private room. I went in, he went in, I went in separately. And then we were informed of the results shortly afterwards. And that's how it happened. If I recall, it all happened in this kind of motel kind of a place in Epsom, near Newmarket. So I can't remember the exact address, but it was, that's the process, and I guess it still is the process. It's done by the board, not the members.
Right.
And I was wondering what your impression of New Zealand was at the time that you became the leader. More specifically, maybe your impression on John Key's government and their running at the time of New Zealand.
Well, there was a feeling at that time that things were going rather well in New Zealand. The economy had been going well for a while. I mean, the there had been the financial crisis, which had been a bit of a setback, but it was the general feeling was that the government had managed that well, and that everything was kind of on track economically. And I think it felt like a happy and prosperous country at the time. Um, but I suspected, and I think it's been borne out, that John Key wasted his popularity. He refused to make any take on. He didn't really do much at all. There weren't many significant policy changes under his regime, and he failed to address the biggest problem, which is now really biting, which is the constraints on property development imposed by the Resource Management Act. And I campaigned quite hard on that, but nobody cared because they didn't see it as a big problem at the time. But now I think people can see that it is a very big problem. But I think his was a disappointing government in many ways. He was very popular, but he coasted on the good times that he had and his popularity, and didn't take the difficult actions that would have made New Zealand better off today.
So can you describe your experience of running for Parliament? And more specifically, I was wondering about, do you believe there was a media bias against the ACT Party? I've read in both their books from Rodney Hyde and Don Brash. They found a lot of media bias from, against the ACT Party.
Well, I've never been in politics in the UK, but I've been close to politics in the UK. And I can tell you that the way I was treated in New Zealand, both by the other politicians and by the media, was far better than I would expect to be treated if I were involved in politics in Britain, no matter what party I was involved with. New Zealand politics is just conducted in a much more civilized way than most countries, certainly than Britain, and certainly more civilized than in Australia. So I can't really complain about my treatment too much. I mean, for example, ACT was always seen as this kind of far-right party, which I think is a mistake. It's not really far-right. I guess it's right-wing in some sense, but it's got quite libertarian tendencies, which isn't really a right-wing position. But anyway, I was considered kind of extreme characters. And yet, online I got a certain amount of abuse, but of course everybody does online. I never got any abuse anywhere in the country. Nobody yelled obscenities at me or anything of the sort. In fact, I might go to poor areas where you expect me to be hated even more. The only time I got a little bit of abuse was by some very kind of well-off woman in Ponsonby. And of course it was rather polite abuse. The media, well, the first thing I'll say is they gave me plenty of attention. I didn't feel like they weren't giving me a platform, if you see what I mean. So I can't complain about that. They were, on the whole, polite. I think the problem that ACT has is that most journalists are just kind of what you might call as unthinking centre-leftists. That's roughly the position of all of them. Some of them are far left, but most of them just kind of orthodox centre-left. And they almost can't believe, they can't get their heads around ACT's position on some things. They really can't. It's as if they don't even understand it. But no, I'm not going to complain about it. I don't feel I was mistreated. I mean, politics is a tough game. When they sense blood, they like sharks. They go for it. But that's the game you're in.
Oh, okay. When you became leader in 2014, was there a discussion on you becoming the absent representative or the candidate for that electorate instead of David Seymour?
There was. That was the big issue, in fact. Would I be if I'd done that, I guess I would have got elected. And the view that I took, along with David and along with several of the board members, was that it was insufficiently ambitious. Like all we were really trying to do, if we'd taken that strategy, we were basically saying, look, we're not going to get anything more than X, and let's not even bother trying. Let's just make sure that the leader gets into Parliament. So now, as it turned out, the people who thought that we were being over-ambitious, and that's all we could achieve. That's what we should do. They were right. And so I often look back and think, well, I made that decision. Did I make a mistake? But, probably not, because David Seymour has turned out to be a very capable politician, and I wasn't. So I think the ACT Party is doing better today than it would be doing if I'd been in David's position. So I think the party survived. I mean, I'm committed to ACT. I really believe in it, and I became very fond of many of the people in it during my time there. So I'm really happy to see them doing so well. And I also honestly believe that they're doing better with David than they would have done with me.
Okay. And I was wondering your impressions on the former leaders of the party. You've got Roger Douglas, Richard Preble, Rodney Hyde, Don Brash, and John Banks.
I don't know Rodney Hyde very well. He'd had an unpleasant exit from politics about 4 years before I turned up back in New Zealand. And he wasn't hanging around the party. So I didn't get to know him. So I can't really comment on that. I know Don Brash quite well. I knew Don before I got involved with the ACT Party. And I have a very high regard for Don's intellect. And he's a curious man in some ways, but I think he's a man of honor and integrity. So I have a high opinion of Don. I think he campaigned, he had his big success when he was the National Party leader with the speech he made about Maori rights and stuff. And he tried to campaign on that basis again when he was leader of ACT. And it just didn't resonate as it had the first time. And I think that was his main blunder. I think if Don had a bigger role in New Zealand politics over the years, New Zealand would be a better place. So that's Don. Richard Preble acted as my kind of campaign advisor. And I got to know him well and became extremely fond of Richard. He's very funny, he's a very witty guy, he's very smart. And he was an instrumental part of that Rogernomics revolution back in the mid-'80s. And so I think he's a great man and a very capable politician. And of course, when he was leader of the ACT Party, ACT was doing pretty well. I mean, David, I think, has just surpassed him. He was doing very well. The only person who I think, in a certain sense, is the odd one out, really doesn't fit, is John Banks. John Banks really is a conservative politically, not a libertarian. He belongs in the National Party. And even in the National Party, he's really in a certain kind of faction of the National Party, what you might call the slightly more angry faction, the kind of, you know what I mean, the
yes.
kind of, he's not a liberal. And so he never kind of fitted too well. And I always got the feeling that the members of the party and the board, they didn't really, he ended up there because the way Don managed the kicking out of Rodney Hyde and all that stuff. And so it was an oddity. It was a historical oddity that John Banks was ever leader of the ACT Party. And now they've got somebody who fits very well. I mean, David Seymour was, I think, the leader of ACT on campus when he was at Auckland University. And then he went and worked at a Canadian think tank which promoted free market economic ideas and that kind of thing. So he really fits the position perfectly well.
Okay. Other than the Resource Management Act liberalisation that we just discussed before, what objectives do you think you would have pushed for as a Member of Parliament if you were elected instead of with David Seymour in 2014?
Well, the one that I was quite keen on was, I think in the end we moderated the policy. I wanted to abolish corporation tax or company tax, as it's known in New Zealand. The policy we actually had in the end, I think, was to reduce it to 19%. It's better to abolish it. Corporation tax or company tax it's a very popular tax because people think that they don't pay it. They think some kind of anonymous entity bears the cost of it. But only humans can bear the cost of taxes. And it's been shown in the economic literature that company taxes have a very negative effect on investment and economic growth generally. And not all taxes are equally bad, and that's a very bad one. So it would have been good to get rid of that. Another thing that, it would sound very shocking to many people, but if New Zealand had become a tax haven, that would have actually been very advantageous for New Zealand. Lots of investment would have flowed into the country. Ireland has done brilliantly, in part by having a very low corporate tax rate. Unfortunately, now there's a kind of international conspiracy from the big countries to stop any little country from having low or zero corporate tax rates. And the Irish have just been coerced into putting theirs up to 15%. So though that was a policy I was very keen on at the time, we would have taken a lot of guts to stick with it. We campaigned a little bit on crime. That was a legacy of the Rodney Hyde days. I have mixed feelings about it now. We were known as, we had the 3 strikes and you're out policy, and all that tough on crime stuff. I mean, I do believe that being tough on crime is an important part of having a liberal society, because people need to feel safe to go about their business, not just because the government might interfere with them, but other private people might interfere with them. One of the proper functions of the state is to protect us from criminals. So I'm not against it in principle, but it's just that I'm not sure it had the right, it's called optics, it was the right way of selling the party, and my heart wasn't really in it. So I regret that element of our campaign.
Okay, and I was wondering, what's your view on the current state of the ACT Party? I understand you live in the UK now, but what is your opinion on the current state of the UK and maybe of the ACT Party, and their future prospects?
Well, I'm reluctant to say too much because I haven't been involved. I've been in England. I mean, the obvious thing to say is that it's just done incredibly well at the last election, best ever result, and it's polling, I think, now higher than it's ever polled. So these are fantastic results, and I think, as far as I can tell from over here, they're due mainly to the fact that until the last election, David was the sole member of Parliament who was actually opposing Jacinda Ardern. He was, I think, the only one who voted against her speech legislation and the firearms legislation. So he's done fantastically well. And now, one of the problems you have, if you're a minor party, is it's difficult to attract high-caliber candidates. I don't know who is in the party at the moment, so I'm not making any personal comments here. I know Brooke Van Velden, she is high-caliber. So, but one thing that's going to really work in David's favour now is that when the next election comes around, people are going to be queuing up to run for ACT because they've got a good chance of getting into Parliament. And so he'll be in a much stronger position when it comes to selecting, prominent, high-caliber New Zealanders to be on the list. So I think the prospects are very good. National's demise is also good for ACT, obviously, but they kind of occupy a bit of the same space politically. And Nationals have been in disarray for a while. They don't really seem to know what they're all about. I don't think they ever have, to be honest. And ACT does know what it's all about and always has. And I know David's ambition is to get 20 members of Parliament in the next election. I think that's absolutely doable. I do think that's doable. I think the bigger ambition would be to become the main party that isn't Labour, right? To replace National as the opposition to Labour. I think to have a principled party opposing National would be opposing Labour would be fantastic. So I don't think it's booming. I gives me a little pang of regret, you can imagine.
Yes, I really appreciate you talking to me today. You've given me a lot of great insight, especially into the 2014 election.
No problem. You're welcome.